Hello, it's Douglas Scott McCarron again. It's been about a week since I put up anything about the Ukraine war. This is about expectations, disappointments, and opinion making. Today is 582 of Vlad the Murderer's plan to make Ukraine friendly to Russia, even though most Russians and Ukrainians seem to get along in the first place. If it is going according to the plan, it's an awfully strange plan. A milestone of sorts was passed recently. I am reading the Ukrainian estimates of Russian losses, which claims there have been over 250,000 Russians liquidated. Some insist this means dead. Others say dead, wounded, and missing. I don't know myself, and I doubt the other commentators really know either. But if this is even close, that is 250,000 lost for nothing really, except a dream of Russian imagination. Well, some Russians' imagination, though not all. And it doesn't seem to include the DPR and LPR casualties. Add those and the human costs of the side of the war, it is approaching staggering, especially as one of the stated goals of the Russian government was protecting and freeing the ethnic Russians in the Donbass. Not sure destroying ethnic Russian towns and getting them killed by the tens of thousands gets to that goal. There are also reports of Ukrainian forces penetrating the first line of Russian defenses and crossing the Dnipro River. Interesting. This makes good sense, spreading the Russian concentrations out. One doesn't need to destroy the entire defensive line, just points that allowed penetration to make the rest of the line no longer useful. I want to talk about expectations, disappointments, and opinion making. A lot of people seem to be mistaking their expectations as a gauge of success, and Ukrainian failure to meet these expectations as sign that the Ukrainians failed and everything is a disappointment. Just to remind people sitting at home having thoughts and opinions. Those are thoughts and opinions in your minds. The war is real. As Zelensky pointed out, this isn't a movie. I'm not saying you shouldn't have your opinions, just that they aren't real. If you're on the front line of the gun, that is real. And that is where all the disappointment and statements of Ukrainian failure lies. At home, in your opinion. Not in Ukraine, where 44 million people want to avoid having their culture, language, and people subjugated. It is common for the populace to mistake the news and opinions for the actual struggle. Humans tend to live in our inner discussions on things instead of the actual things. And all this is my opinion, of course, though I don't think my thoughts have anything to do with the failure or success for Ukraine. My sending $1,000 of support at least bought some bullets and food. One subject I have heard about in all this opinion, disappointment, and failure is the discussion about if the F-16s had been sent earlier, if the Russian defense line had been prevented, the West's delay on delivery of equipment allowed the construction of the defense line, so it was the West that failed, and we are disappointed with the West. Some even think the USA is purposely withholding equipment, pointing at the F-16s and Abrams tanks that are supposed to be there now. I think many just assume that because they imagine something could or should happen, that means things must just magically appear. This is a case of living in one's imagination and expectations, but it takes work and time to first identify what is needed, what order to send things in. If you send the Abrams now, how much cargo space is taken up by that, which could have been thousands of 155 artillery shells the Ukrainians need now, but didn't get so 31 tanks could show up on a 1,900-mile-long border somewhere. With the reduction of the military-industrial complex after the Cold War, the armaments industry was reduced. Not just for production, but the location of equipment, bombs, fuel, needs of people who already have the equipment, the ability to move these things around. It seems a lot of people just think they should move these Abrams or F 16s from here to there, and it is simple. I imagined it. Why isn't it there? But there's a lot of locating, packing, inventorying of it, tracking it to its destination, transit by train, moving it to ports or airfields, if by port, a couple of weeks floating on the oceans, arriving and offloading, maintaining, sorting, deploying, organizing. And then you can hand those artillery shells to someone to shoot them. People seem to forget that in the two Gulf Wars, before the sweeping tank strikes, before the weeks of long air campaigns, there were months of transporting and organizing equipment and men. You can't just say, move this pile of stuff and people to wherever and whenever and then have them attack. Well, you can, but as the Russians are showing, it doesn't work out well. Since those wars, the USA has reduced its ability to move things around, which is kind of a warning for the future. So, F 16s. Would they really massively help? There is a lot of demanding F 16s be there now, now, now. With the current transport system, well, it takes time. Plus, F 16s are one part of an entire air combat system, all of which has to be present for the F 16s to be really effective. To many, the delivery seems slow, but things don't move at the speed of imagination. For instance, the USA currently has one factory building 155 howitzer shells. It makes roughly 11,000 every month, but Ukraine is firing about half of that each day. So stockpiles are being drawn down, and one doesn't want to run out, or you won't have any shells to shoot. Then Ukraine will really be in trouble. While F 16s would provide air superiority and suppress the Russian Air Force and open placed Russian artillery, they fly at such a speed that their time on target is in milliseconds. They can't really hit a trench easily. They do have complex computer systems and self-guiding rockets that will allow them to hit targets. I know it is fashionable to talk about the Russians as incompetent dullards, but they aren't. They have very good equipment, even if it is not as good as the USA. And F 16s would have to get out of Dodge quick once they fire before S 400 and 300 systems hit them from the Russians. There is also the cost balance. The cost of F 16s range between $12.7 to $63 million apiece, depending on the variant. Add jet fuel costs, support costs, systems to defend them. F 16s are an expensive way to deliver a bomb. How much do shells for a 155 howitzer cost? There are at least 30 variants, running between $500 to $1.7 million each. So let's say 100 F 16s at $12.7 million would cost, $1,270 million. At $63 million, that cost would be $6,300 million. But let's compare this to 155 shells. And remember, the F 16s will be stripped down to keep technology out of the Russians' hands. So let's say the average cost of a 100 F 16, given the information above, is $3,785 million. Then add fuel, bombs, support personnel, and equipment. 155 shells running between 500 and 1.7 million, though the majority of them are closer to the $500 version. I set an average of, say, $2,500 a shell to account for the many variants. Starting with the assumed F-16 cost of $3,785,000 and divide that by 25,000 per 155 shell, the result is 1,514,155 shells. 100 F-16 making strikes is a lot less than that many 155 shells. It is also a lot less risky to fire the shells and deliver explosions than having an F-16 flying around. You can have a lot more howitzers firing shells than F-16s dropping bombs. And soon the U.S. will be delivering cheaper guided bombs that go a greater distance to be fired by the 155 howitzers. Some people believe that if F-16s had been provided several months ago, they would have prevented the Russians from building the fortified system that the Ukrainians are fighting through right now. I don't know if that is really accurate. F-16s flying in rain and snow conditions looking for forts that haven't been completed yet, or maybe even not started yet, probably wouldn't have prevented the building of that line. That's my opinion, true, but you can't bomb something that isn't there yet. It might have slowed down the line, but I doubt it would have prevented it. I think it is still better to let it get built and sighted and then hit with the shells so you know you hit something. Like people make fun of the Russians having these little dumps of shells laying around outside, and the Ukrainians just drop a grenade on them and they blow up. But that makes a lot more sense rather than having the shells in the bunkers that the Russians have and you drop a grenade into the door, because then it would blow up the whole trench system and the soldiers in it. Again, the Russians aren't stupid. They're putting them away from their trenches so that their trenches don't get destroyed by one hand grenade. Let's say an F-16 drops a bomb on something and flies away. Okay, that leaves 23 hours and however many minutes for a bunch of Russians to keep digging. So, once the F-16s leave, they dig. 300,000 Russians digging, well, some sort of defense line would have appeared. I even wonder if Russians were digging for several months while the West dithered bringing equipment. But remember those rains of fall and winter, those images of tanks stuck on the mud? If the Russians used entrenching machinery at that time, I think they would have become stuck in the mud just like the tanks, though they could dig themselves out. It wasn't the best trench digging weather. Try digging a trench in a water-soaked field of mud. Most likely the sides will keep collapsing in while the trench constantly fills with water. Eventually you can do it, but it isn't something you can do in a few days. I question if a couple hundred F-16s dropping bombs into seas of mud would have done much. I suspect most of the impact would have been absorbed by the mud, and everything would have just been turned into mud splatter. I don't know if the Russians built this system over all those several months, or was it started last summer and completed more recently once the ground dried up. I just think this whole discussion that if only this equipment was there, it would have prevented it, is possibly not accurate. And in the end, the trenches I don't think really matter. It is the minefields that matter. And they are deployed by equipment that spews out hundreds, thousands of mines in a day. Those are the issues. Those in the artillery that can spew out mines. That's what needs to be removed before Ukraine can move forward. I'm not saying the defenses aren't there. I just wonder if it was built the way people think it was. And again, I suggest it is actually better to have all this buildup completed, because with the defenses set, the Russians need to bring in troops, ammo, and supplies to the front to be available, which means the Ukrainians know where all these are and can bomb them. Now, once it's there, F-16s might be able to help, but they aren't imagined miracle weapons that could have prevented the construction of the defensive. Another suggestion is F-16s could prevent the Russians from using their aircraft and helicopters to shoot at the advancing Ukrainians. For some reason, the Russian air impact has slackened recently. I guess Ukraine has taken some steps to cause this, or the Russians are low on either aircraft or things to shoot. I wonder if all this punditry is designed to increase a sense of conflict, expectations, and assumptions, because it gets eyeballs, which increases ad revenue. What they say may be their opinion, but I don't think that makes them accurate or true. YouTube is full of people presenting themselves as experts, warning us that we haven't thought of this, that, or the other thing. Listen to me, I will tell you. Or they assert that authorities are stupid and haven't thought of whatever theory is being presented. One guy named Peter keeps starting his videos with, "I warned you," and then comments appear about how wise he is. But he has a lot of videos that predict what hasn't happened. Like roughly 500 days ago, he stated that the Chinese economy would fall apart in 23 days. It's a long time since 23 days passed. China is having issues, but it isn't like he is the only one looking at this. Remember the vast majority of pundits saying Russia would roll over Ukraine in a few days? Did that happen? Remember predictions of Russian tanks rolling through the Donbass? Instead, there's trench warfare. Remember the predictions of stalemate in the Kherson area? Instead, there was the Kharkiv offensive. And now many predict Ukraine would sweep to the Sea of Azov. Though I should note, the Ukrainian military didn't predict this. They said they wanted to, but it was not certain. Humans seem to be convinced that their imagination predicts the future, but it seldom does. Russia expected to be welcomed with flowers and open arms. Ukrainians opened their arms, just not in a friendly way. The failure of the current offensive isn't the Ukrainians' failure, because it isn't over yet. All this failure discussion is from the uninvolved peanut gallery judging from their internal assertions and beliefs. But this conflict isn't expectations or opinions. It's a war. Vlad the child abductor's war started to protect ethnic Russians, all coming out of his internal dreams. And now apparently 250,000 Russians have died, plus who knows how many ethnic Russians in the DPR and LPR, and their cities have been razed to the ground. Seems to me it would have been a lot cheaper and easier just to give these people money and houses to move to in Russia. But that didn't happen. And now we have this mess. I'm not trying to minimize what is happening to Ukrainians, but notice that this imagined result of freeing and protecting the Russians has resulted in all this horror and death inflicted on the Russian people in order to protect the Russian people. Kind of reminds me of the USA talking about blowing up Vietnamese in order to protect them. There is one pundit who puzzles me, who is Ben Hodges. He said in the past that if Ukraine had F-16s and ATACMS, that would assure Ukraine could occupy Crimea by the end of the summer of 2023. He also said he didn't understand why the West doesn't openly declare that we are striving for Ukrainian victory, which kind of implies Russian defeat. Now, the F-16s and ATACMS were not delivered, so it makes sense why the prediction of Crimea being captured didn't happen. But Mr. Hodges, not understanding why we don't declare we want victory in Ukraine, is odd to me. In Russia, that would imply defeating Russia. The propaganda of Russia is presenting this conflict as a war of salvation and survival against the USA and the combined West. I don't know how many Russians actually believe this. A lot of them didn't support starting the war, but now their country is in a war, they feel they have to support their country, even if they aren't passionate about it. But I ask, what impact would there be in Russia if the President of the United States said on television that Russia needs to be defeated? And that was played in Russia 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I suspect, though I don't know, that the inner politics of Russia would change and the desire to fight would probably multiply. And the government and TV would use it to show that the Russian leadership was right all along. The West was out to get Russia. So I question the wisdom of Mr. Hodges' statement. He has said that without a clearly stated goal, there can't be effective policy. Why he assumes there isn't a clearly stated goal, I'm not sure, as he is not in the meetings of the policy-making rooms. I know the U.S. government has said they will support Ukraine all the way through to the end. That seems like a clear goal to me, and it's much better than declaring Russia must be defeated, especially if the defeat of Russia may not be the goal. Just get the hell out of Ukraine. All of it. Overall, I think the main enemy is each of our imagination. Russians imagined, West imagines, the image that Russians have a single imagination, that the West has a single imagination, all imagined. Russians imagine Ukraine is a false country invented only in their minds, ignoring that the same is true of Russia. Some imagine anything less than the Kharkiv breakthrough being repeated in the current battles is a failure, and then we have to doubt Ukraine if we don't get our beliefs in real life. We want our beliefs and imagination, which isn't the same as 44 million people preventing being ground under by a neighbor. Many people imagine something is true, and if that imagination is not met, then there is a failure. But it isn't a failure. This isn't a war of YouTube opinions. Ukraine has not failed. Over thousands of years of human history, someone who's gotten themselves into a position of power has imagined something must be true and is desired, and then that person is dragged around like slaves by their imagination, all the while thinking they are the ones with power when they are actually slaves to their imagination, causing death and destruction to bring a dream into reality, killing and maiming for no really good reason. So hopefully the Russians will just go home. Build houses for the ethnic Russians in Russia. Russia has lots of land and resources. Make babies. Enjoy parties. All they are doing is being slaves to their assumptions. And when they die, someone will make up stories and remember them. Except all the people who know them will die and forget them. What is the point of being remembered like Peter the Great when Peter the Great is just an imagined self-importance dream people use in their internal discussion? He's just Peter the Dead. Like Gilgamesh said, forget all this stuff. Make out with a spouse. Make babies. Enjoy life. These dreams cause nothing but useless conflict.